A jump in the state's income tax kicked in last Monday, part of Governor Malloy's efforts to balance the budget. The new tax rate is set to last about 2 years. The average family will see their personal income taxes go up by less than $150 a year. The governor made a comment that has raised some eyebrows, saying, among other things, that people knew the hike was in the works, that for the vast majority of residents it will have no impact, and that for those who will have an impact, they can, quote unquote, handle it. That is not really sitting well with some, including our next guest, Representative Jason Perillo. Thanks, Jason, for being here.
Yeah, thanks.
If you could talk about, doesn't he have a point, though? I mean, he did let people know that it was going to happen, that it was coming down the pike. So, they had a little time to prepare for it, maybe set aside some money. I don't know if people have money to set aside, but...
Well, and therein lies the problem. To say that folks have known about it and therefore they should be able to handle it, you got to get out and talk to people, and you got to get out to realize that times are very, very difficult, as everybody knows. Mm-hmm. To simply say, well, you should have been saving back in February when I first announced there was going to be a tax increase. Well, I think that's a little bit ignorant to the problems that people are experiencing.
Yeah, I would agree. Maybe it wasn't the best way to put it.
Certainly not.
Is it a big deal? If the average person has to pay $150 a year, that's like less than $3 a week.
Well, it's not that easy, and it's not that low. We're seeing that in many cases, a lot of families are paying more, not just because of the actual tax increase, but especially because of the fact that it's retroactive. Mm-hmm. We passed a tax increase, well, I should say, those who voted for the tax increase, I did not, mm-hmm. Passed it, in June, and then said, oh, by the way, we know you worked that overtime back in January. We know you tried to pay those bills back in January. You had the oil bill. You had the fuel bills. You paid those, and you worked overtime to do it. But we want some of that money back, and we're going to take it now in August. It's just not fair to families that are struggling in these times.
And I know, but this kind of brings us back to the question that we've heard so much over the past few months is, but what would you have him do? He has to. We have a massive budget deficit. He has to close the gap. No one wants cuts to services. Our last guests don't want the ferries closed. People don't want layoffs. And I think most experts, on both sides, say it's got to be a combination of both to some extent. Maybe more, I guess Republicans would say more of one than the other. But what would you have him do?
Well, during the legislative session, we actually laid out a number of budget options that actually would not have increased taxes. Mm-hmm. There were significant cuts, and I think for most residents here in the state of Connecticut, they understand that government needs to be smaller. And they understand that cuts are necessary if we're going to save families from having to experience a tax increase. Mm-hmm. The reality is we will spend more this year than we did last year, and more next year than we will have spent this year. That's not a spending cut. That's not getting serious about cuts to the size of government. That's spending increases on the backs of Connecticut taxpayers. It's the reality.
So what can people who are listening to us right now and saying, yeah, I agree with that. I totally agree with that. But what can they do now? It's in effect, and we're all looking. Of course, we're all waiting to see what happens with the union ratification. Perhaps that might change things one way or the other. But what should people who agree with your viewpoint be doing at this point?
Well, you can't unring a bell.
Yeah.
We have a tax increase. It's the governor's tax increase. He laid it out in February, and it became law in June. What I've told my constituents, and you hate to have to say it, but it's reality, this is coming. Mm-hmm. So do your best to prepare. Is it unfair? Yes. Do you like it? No. But keep in mind that you're getting taxed a higher rate, and you're getting taxed for the 7 months that came previously.
So it's a double whammy right there.
It hits you twice. And we're not talking, a lot of folks have said, and the governor has intimated that it's just the rich that are going to see this tax. We're talking about couples making $100,000. That's not a lot of money. That's a police officer and his wife who's a teacher. It's $50,000 for one individual. That's the guy who's trying to save a little extra money and work overtime so he can buy his girlfriend the engagement ring. This isn't somebody you don't know. This is your neighbor. This is your son. This is your daughter. It's real people.
And it's also on top of, as many people who email us would point out, on top of the other tax hikes that we're seeing here in Connecticut. And I'm wondering, we heard a lot from people who were protesting during that whole series of town hall meetings. And certainly as you all were in session. How much are you still hearing from them expressing frustration about the tax hikes here in Connecticut?
Well, you hear of the sales tax, 6% to 6.35. That's a big jump. People experience that every day. We're coming up to the beginning of the school year. Folks are out buying clothes for their kids to get back to school. They're experiencing that increase. Mm-hmm. And here we are, just before that happens, taking more money from them with the income tax increase and taking that money again that they earned back in January, February, March before they knew this was even going to happen.
Right. How much are Republicans working or rallying at this point to change things in the next legislative session, or to make some action in the next?
Well, we're obviously rallying the troops to the best of our ability, and what I tell folks is, we can't do it alone. Republicans are a minority in the House and the Senate, and we have a Democratic governor. And the agenda that they have laid out is obviously a little bit different than what we've laid out. Their agenda is tax increases. It is spending increases, and we quite frankly have a different worldview. We see it differently. So I've reached out to constituents to say, hey, we need some help. Get on the phone, write a letter, send a fax, do whatever you can to make sure that the governor's office and legislative Democrats understand that these tax increases affect people in their everyday lives, and it's not acceptable, and it's not fair. Very
shortly, we will know one way or the other which way that the state unions vote, whether to ratify the new savings and concessions deal or not. And I'm wondering what your feeling is of what's going to happen there.
Like everybody else, nobody wants to see layoffs, and I'm hopeful that the unions will ratify that agreement. I personally, I think it's in their best interest, and it's certainly in the best interest of the state of Connecticut. There will be layoffs, and nobody wants to see that. So hopefully that can be averted.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much to Representative Jason Perillo for spending your time, and we'll certainly check back in with you as things move on. Thanks a lot for being here. Coming up, if you are thinking about buying a house in Connecticut, you might have to look far and wide for something you can afford. Coming up, we talk about why there is a lack of affordable housing here in the state.